Hey, sixth graders. So this next section goes from Oklahoma pretty much up to the advent of rock and roll and how that began to have an influence on the musical. And then the last two sections will go from the 60s right up to present time, and then we'll get into the Phantom of the Opera after we come back from break. So this section goes pretty fast too, so I hope you enjoy it.
Throughout World War II, with the threat of enemy aircraft a constant fear, the lights of New York City were frequently turned off.
Broadway, target number one for pleasure seekers of the world.
This was back before airplanes had radar, and the threat of enemy aircraft coming to the coastline and seeing the lights of a big city like New York City, that's how they would find the city so they could bomb it. So they often turned off the lights so that they couldn't be detected and at least couldn't tell where the city was.
Oh, you can douse its glimmer for an hour. You can pull some switches and make it dark as pitch. But the lights are all there waiting, and they'll come on again as sure as shooting. Because this is Broadway. Because this is America.
In April of '42, Oscar received a phone call from composer Richard Rodgers, who wanted to adapt a play about cowboys and ranchers into a new musical. Rodgers' partner, Larry Hart, was in ill health, depressed and unfit to work. But Hammerstein was intrigued by the homespun drama and teamed up with Rodgers. The resulting show ushered in a new era in musical theater.
Oklahoma, where the wind comes sweeping down the plain, and the waving wheat can sure smell sweet when the wind comes right behind the rain.
Oklahoma is a very simple story, but it is a story.
Musical comedy, which is what it was originally called, stopped really with the Rodgers and Hammerstein shows. The word comedy got dropped. It was then the musical. And from that point on, the creative drive of the shows was from the writers of the show.
Oklahoma signaled the beginning of a time when a well-crafted story, poignant, funny, or dramatic, became the essential element of the Broadway musical.
The curtain went up. There was an old lady sitting there churning butter. Churning butter? That's the opening of a musical? And everybody's saying, what kind of a show is this? What kind of a show is this?
Like it's climbing clear up to the sky. Oh, what a beautiful morning. Oh, what a beautiful day.
Oklahoma also changed the role that dance played in a musical. Choreographer Agnes DeMille was the niece of the epic filmmaker Cecil B. DeMille, and she had strong ideas of how dance could do more than simply entertain.
Up until this time, dance was just kind of an extra piece inside the music, kind of a separate entity. But dance became part of the actual show and part of each character, and this was the beginning of what today is now called the triple threat.
When Oklahoma opened at the St. James Theater, the United States had been at war for 16 months. With empty seats to fill, the cast offered free tickets to coax U.S. servicemen into the theater. The GI's emotional response to the show hinted at the enormous success that was to come. There wasn't another empty seat for years. Not only was Oklahoma the hottest ticket on Broadway, but it led to a best-selling cast album that brought the original performances into living rooms across the nation.
And when we we're only saying no, doing fine.
Oklahoma played for 5 solid years, breaking the record for the longest-running musical by over 800 performances. There are now over 600 productions amateur and professional, in the United States each year. On any given day, 2 separate performances of Oklahoma are likely to be playing somewhere in America.
Hi-ho, everybody, and welcome to On Broadway Tonight.
Throughout the 1950s, the new medium of television raided Broadway talent for its programs, just as Hollywood had done 2 decades earlier. The prestige and sophistication of Broadway musicals was one of the top attractions for millions of eager television viewers. Rodgers and Hammerstein musicals were so popular that when General Foods presented a 90-minute tribute, the special preempted all the Sunday night programs and was broadcast on the 3 major networks simultaneously.
The advent of television made it easy for people who did not live close to New York to be able to actually see Broadway shows and help drive that desire to see them, where people actually started traveling to New York to see a musical live. This was a clip from the musical comedy Tonight Show that was hosted by Groucho Marx. That's Groucho Marx on the right, and Richard Rodgers, not Roy Rogers. Roy Rogers was a famous cowboy, and Oscar Hammerstein. And Groucho Marx was a favorite host of this show for many, many years.
Let's get on with it. Now, let's see, who are you 2 again? Say, you're pretty famous. Every kid in the country knows you, Roy Rogers, huh? King of the Cowboys. Then this must be Trigger, huh?
No, this is Hammerstein.
Well, that's an odd name for a horse.
But it was Ed Sullivan's Sunday night variety show that was the most important showcase for Broadway musicals. Rodgers and Hammerstein appeared on the very first broadcast, and in 1951, accompanied by Gertrude Lawrence, they visited the Ed Sullivan Theater at 1697 Broadway.
If you were on the Ed Sullivan Show, you were pretty much guaranteed that you were going to be famous, at least for a little while. When the Beatles came to America, this was the first show they did, was the Ed Sullivan Show. And Ed Sullivan helped launch the careers of a lot of actors and actresses. This next little section has Gertrude Lawrence singing. I was never a big fan of her voice. You may have a different opinion, but this is Gertrude Lawrence.
You may be afraid, but you make believe you are. You may be afraid, but you make believe you are.
An appearance on Sullivan's top-rated program could turn a flop into a hit. Broadway songwriters Charles Strauss and Lee Adams even went so far as to write Sullivan into their score for Bye Bye Birdie.
Me on the Ed Sullivan Show?
It was art imitating life and back again when Paul Lynde led the cast in Hymn for a Sunday Evening.
Ed Sullivan!
Gananda actually performed Bye Bye Birdie a couple of years ago, and this was a scene from there that referenced the Ed Sullivan Show. The guy you were just listening to, this is Paul Lynde. He was the voice of Templeton in Charlotte's Web, if you saw that. And he was also the voice of Sylvester Sneakley in an old cartoon called Penelope Pitstop. And he was often on the Bewitched television show, if you ever saw that. This whole next section features Julie Andrews, and since we've been listening to her narrate this whole set we've been watching, I thought I would leave this entire section in kind of in its entirety so you can see some of the things that she did.
When I was about 19 years old, I auditioned for Richard Rodgers, and I belted out my aria and sang it as loud as I could, and When I had finished, Mr. Rogers came up on stage and he said, "That was absolutely adequate." And I went, "Oh, really?" And then he cracked up and said, "No, it was wonderful and thank you." And he asked me if I had been auditioning for anything else for the coming season. And I said, "I have been speaking to Alan J. Lerner and Frederick Lowe for a musical that they're considering called My Fair Lady." And Rogers thought about it for a moment and he said, "If they ask you, you should do My Fair Lady. But if they don't ask you, we'd be very interested in using you." And of course, it was the best advice I could possibly have had. Back in 1942, about the same time that Rodgers and Hammerstein were embarking on Oklahoma, a 24-year-old New York City lyricist, Alan J. Lerner, teamed up with a 38-year-old Viennese composer named Frederick Lowe.
We called Frederick Lowe Fritzy, and I met him in my very first show on Broadway. He played the piano in the pit, and he would say, same thing every night. He would say, "Someday," he was Austrian, they had an accent. He would say, "Someday I am going to write the best musical on Broadway." Many, many years later, I'm standing backstage at the opening of My Fair Lady, and Fritzy came over to me and he whispered in my ear and he said, "Well," he said, "I wrote the best musical on Broadway," and indeed he had.
Their lyrics and music would bring romance into the story of a poor flower girl named Eliza Doolittle.
All I want is a room somewhere far away from the cold night air, with one enormous chair. Now, wouldn't it be lovely? Oh,
Selected to play Eliza's teacher, Henry Higgins, was Rex Harrison, a temperamental actor who had never sung on stage.
I knew I was never going to be able to sing properly, so I got this man in with these numbers. And he said, "Well, what about talking on pitch?"
From an average man am I.
An average man am I, of no eccentric wit, who likes to live his life free of strife, doing whatever he thinks is best for him. Well, just an ordinary man. But let a woman in your life. Stop, 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 stop! Take it out. I demand that be taken out.
Take out what?
That ya-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta. It's so loud. How do I know where to sing?
You'll get used to it, right?
I will never get used to it.
You know, you rehearse with the piano, and then you hear the orchestra, and instead of hearing da-da-da-dee-da-dum, da-da-da-dee-da-dum, you hear diddle-diddle-diddle-diddle, boom-boom-boom, diddle-diddle-diddle-diddle, boom-boom-boom, and you don't know where you are. This happens to many people, including a good singer. Well, Rex panicked.
We have to come to some understanding about this, you know, otherwise the curtain will not go up tomorrow night.
Rex Harrison's stage jitters and the inexperience of the leading lady were swept aside by director Moss Hart, and when My Fair Lady opened in March 1956, it was immediately hailed as a landmark of the American musical.
I could have danced all night, I could have danced all night, and still have begged for more.
This quintessential Cinderella story was irresistible to America, and My Fair Lady played for a record-breaking 6 years on Broadway. The original cast album stayed on the bestseller charts for 482 weeks, setting a record that would outlast Elvis Presley and the Beatles.
That record stood for a very long time and beat out a lot of top artists. Today, the longest record to be on any chart is Pink Floyd's The Dark Side of the Moon, which was on the Billboard charts for over 830 weeks, which is 15 years.
In 1957, Mary Martin asked Rodgers and Hammerstein to write a single song for a play she was working on, a project that ultimately became The Sound of Music. During the writing, Oscar began to suffer stomach pains, and after rehearsals began, he was diagnosed with cancer. Its unwavering optimism was a fitting final statement of Oscar's philosophy of hope.
The hills are alive with the sound of music, with songs they have sung for 1,000 years.
To many critics, The Sound of Music seemed hopelessly outdated. But audiences loved it, and the feature film was a blockbuster, reinvigorating the classic big-screen musical.
Wants to beat like the wings of the birds that rise from the lake to the trees. My heart wants to sigh like a chime that flies from a church on a breeze.
Oscar Hammerstein died at home on August 23, 1960. That night, for the first time in theatrical history, both Broadway and London's West End honored the same man. The lights in London were dimmed for 3 minutes in tribute, but in Times Square, traffic came to a complete halt, and the lights on Broadway were turned off completely.
Bless my homeland forever.
Other than when the lights were turned off during World War II to prevent fighter pilots from finding New York City, the lights on Broadway have only been turned off 3 other times in history. Once when George M. Cohan died, once when Oscar Hammerstein died, and then after the attacks on 9/11, the lights were turned off both to prevent people from finding New York because they thought the threat of other airplanes was still there, even though modern airplanes had radar. But they were also turned off in tribute to all the people who died during the attacks.
Next, Broadway embraces new traditions and reinvents itself in the 60s and 70s. From West Side Story to Hair, from cabaret to a chorus line, it's all on Broadway, the American musical. In the 1960s, the traditional Broadway musical fell out of step as rock music, the civil rights movement, and the Vietnam War had a profound effect on American culture. In the 1950s, while the choreographer Jerome Robbins was making his mark on Broadway with such shows as The King and I and Peter Pan, he was also developing a pet project, adapting Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet into a musical. Robbins collaborated with playwright Arthur Lawrence and composer Leonard Bernstein, and they set the tragedy amid the warring gangs of New York City.
There was one area where we did break new ground, and that is in the subject matter. That was the beginning of it being okay to die, to be murdered in a musical. At the same time, Lenny Bernstein's music was different from anybody who has ever written for musical theater. I think it's the most exciting thing about West Side Story. It has a vitality, an energy, an originality, and it says America to me.
Life can be bright in America
If you can fight in America,
Life is all right in America
if you're all white in America.
In bringing his great talent as a symphonic composer, Leonard Bernstein made a kind of score that had rhythms that people just hadn't had on Broadway. And then you have the genius of Robbins' choreography and direction. The influences, inspirations are still so potent today in its clothing and its look and its stylization. I think that West Side Story was the forerunner of all MTV with its style, putting people stylized dancing in the middle of streets as in the movie.
When West Side Story opened in 1957, its reviews were mixed. Broadway's smash hit that season was actually The Music Man, featuring a very different kind of dance in the gymnasium.
People walk out on shows, and those are very often the shows that become historical.
West Side Story not only brought decidedly untraditional subject matter to the musical stage, it ushered in a new breed of director-choreographer who insisted on performers who could dance, sing, and act.
This is where we really see that triple threat come into play, and now that's the standard for musicals. If you want to be a star on Broadway or even be in the ensemble in a Broadway show today, you have to be able to not only sing, but also act and also dance.
The show also united two ambitious and talented young friends. A 29-year-old producer, Harold Prince, who wanted to direct, and a 27-year-old lyricist, Stephen Sondheim, who wanted to compose.
We were good friends. And it's true, we sat in Walgreens drugstore and ate bacon, lettuce, tomato sandwiches and talked about the theater and what we'd like to do in it.
It would be 13 years before Hal Prince would direct a Stephen Sondheim show. But together, they would reimagine what a musical could sing about on Broadway.